just so people know how we got into this dreadful mess of total world government led by the United States. This guy, Edward Mandell House, he was from Texas, called a kingmaker back in those days in the early part of the 20th century. He picked men that were corrupt, controllable, and would propel them into the governorship, Texas, Senate, State House, U.S. Senate. He was an agent of the Rothschild Syndicate, purportedly an agent of J.P. Morgan, but of course Morgan himself was an agent of the Rothschild Syndicate, like John D. Rockefeller. They were the American business agents anointed to monopolize various fields, banking, oil, railroading, so forth. 1911, though, House, he was called Colonel House. It was like Colonel Sanders. He wasn't a military man. He was like 5 feet tall, and it was an honorary thing, Kentucky Colonel. Anyway, they called him Colonel. I don't know why. But in 1911, he anonymously wrote this book called Philip Drew Administrator. And it had to be anonymous because it was very amateurishly written, but it was also extremely subversive. It was a blueprint for the fascist takeover of the United States. 1911 was before we heard of fascism, communism, or even totalitarianism. But Philip Drew Administrator was the blueprint for totalitarian rule of the United States and the world. Just as he had done in Texas, he got the assignment to pick a candidate for president, and he cast around and seized on this very pompous, self-important man, Princeton University President Woodrow Wilson. He groomed him, and by November 1912, he'd also arranged for Teddy Roosevelt to run again on the new Bull Moose Party ticket. In so doing, he split the Republican vote that would have gone to William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson managed to take advantage of that and win the presidency in November 1912. And in the first year, 1913, Edward House, his Svengali-type controller, managed to do these three things. He arranged for the Federal Reserve Act to be passed by those machinations in the Senate when everybody went home for Christmas and just a few guys hung around knowing what they were going to do, and they had a quorum. So they passed the Federal Reserve Act, which probably wouldn't have passed because of the opposition, the knowledge that it was the Aldrich Hill, Rockefeller, Rothschild takeover. He also managed to pass the 16th Amendment, the income tax, which was the collection agency. The IRS became the collection agency for this private central bank called the Federal Reserve. And he managed to pass the 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators. I mean, it was remarkable what he achieved in Wilson's first year. In 1915, meeting with the King of England, and the King said to him, suppose the Lusitania would be sunk by German submarines. What do you think would happen? And House said, well, I think he would probably join in the war. 1916, Woodrow Wilson got reelected as a man of peace. The slogan was, he kept us out of war, because the Great War had started in 1914. But by 1917, Colonel House, Bernard Baruch, Samuel Untermeyer, Felix Frankfurter, and Louis Brandeis blackmailed Wilson into declaring war. And Wilson cited the Lusitania having been sunk 2 years before as the cause of his ally. A week after declaring war on Germany, Colonel House sent Leon Trotsky and 350 of his Menshevik communists from New York City to Petrograd, or St. Petersburg, to meet with Lenin. Lenin had been sent up there to Petrograd from Zurich by the German army. So now we're at war with Germany, but the American president and the German government sent these two communists. Trotsky was called a Menshevik, and Lenin was called a Bolshevik. It just meant majority and minority, vice versa. But they sent these two guys to St. Petersburg to take over the Russian government so that the Russian government would declare peace with Germany and free up all these soldiers on the Eastern Front so they could go over to the Western Front where the Americans were coming in to fight and to kill them. That was the American president doing that. I mean, that's a textbook example of the definition of treason, giving aid and comfort to the enemy in time of war. Not only did that happen, but Colonel House arranged for this Bolshevik takeover of Russia. I mean, it's incredible what this guy did. After the war was over, there was the Treaty of Versailles. House developed the League of Nations, the first United Nations. Most of the countries in Europe joined it, but the American Senate wouldn't go along. They refused to ratify it. The House, of course, was furious. This was his whole goal of taking over the American presidency with his puppet, Woodrow Wilson, the world government. And when that finally fell through in 1921, he and his assistants, the Dulles brothers, Allen Dulles, who became the head of CIA, John Foster Dulles, became Secretary of State under Eisenhower. They formed the Council on Foreign Relations in 1921, and that became the actual de facto government that it is today of the United States. They choose all personnel who are going to be in the government. Every important assistant, every important secretary is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. It is the private ministry for war. And of course, 1921, exactly 20 years later, because of this Council on Foreign Relations, we went to war against Germany again, 1941. House's final curse against America was to have the Democrat Party pick Franklin Roosevelt to run in 1932. So you talk about the indispensable man. This level destroyed America, literally, with the Federal Reserve, with the 16th Amendment, the 17th Amendment. The Constitution is a contract between the states. The states were represented by the U.S. Senate, and the senators were appointed. People were represented in the House of Representatives. They were elected. Colonel House changed all that by having the direct election of senators, the 17th Amendment. So the states were no longer represented. It just became a total fraud. The Constitution, as flawed as it was, it became totally null and void, technically in 1914 when it finally came into effect. Because of the Council on Foreign Relations, the private ministry of war. We're always going to war. We live in a constant state of war ever since 1921 when this organization was formed. Remember the bonus army demonstrations in Washington, D.C. back in 32. The veterans of World War I had been promised a bonus at some point in the future. Well, by 1932, we were in the depths of this Federal Reserve-caused depression. People were actually starving to death. As Russian researchers have found, we lost approximately 6 to 7 million Americans during the Depression. It started in 29 with the crash on Wall Street. But by 1932, people were starving to death. So these veterans from World War I camped out in Washington and demanded their bonus. Well, the U.S. government didn't want to give it to them. Thought it'd be inflationary. And the U.S. Army burned down their camps. Some guys got killed. George Patton was there. A guy named Joe Angelo had saved Patton when he was shot over in France during the war. Joe Angelo pulled Patton into a foxhole, sheltered him, and covered him with his body and protected him. Patton actually, on horseback, ran Joe Angelo out of Washington, D.C. And Angelo said, "Hey, don't you remember me? I saved your ass." It was commanded by Douglas MacArthur, Chief of Staff of the Army, and his assistant, Dwight David Eisenhower. It was just disgraceful. Shows the perfidy and the treachery of the United States government. There's supposedly 4,000, 4,400 or something members of the Council on Foreign Relations now. To me, that's the heart of the conspiracy against humanity. These guys are behind everything. And of course, they have offshoots. The Trilateral is just an offshoot of the Council on Foreign Relations, and it included some guys from overseas. There was supposed to be 80 members from North America, Canada, and U.S., 80 members from Western Europe, and 80 members from Japan. That's how it started out when Brzezinski and Rockefeller put it together back in like 71. Jimmy Carter was brought in. He had no foreign experience as the governor of Georgia. He was groomed by Brzezinski for some time, then run as the presidential candidate. Brzezinski just did a Colonel House. Colonel House picked Woodrow Wilson. Brzezinski picked Jimmy Carter for the Democrat Party. And it's the same thing. It never changes, but it's always the Council on Foreign Relations behind it. You've seen that video of Hillary Clinton at the Washington, D.C. office of the Council on Foreign Relations. She gets up there and she talks to Haas, the head of the CFR. She's kissing his ring. She says, "Oh, it's good to be here at the Council on Foreign Relations' new Washington, D.C. office. I've been to the mothership several times, meaning the New York headquarters. It's on Park Avenue and 68th Street. But," she said, "now you don't have to go so far to be told what to think. It's just right down the street from the State Department," she said. There's this clown admitting that the Council on Foreign Relations tells the U.S. State Department what to do, how to think. That was the whole deal. It was about internationalism. Foreign relations. The State Department was the first infiltration. They started controlling members of the State Department. Eventually, of course, they just took over the whole government. Every single secretary in the cabinet is a member of the CFR. Presidents are often members, if not before, then as they become president. The CIA director, the FBI, all these subversive agencies are staffed by Council on Foreign Relations back in the 50s. The congressman from Tennessee, Carroll Reese, decided that he was going to investigate the tax-exempt foundations. So he sent his investigator. He talked to these 3 tax-exempt foundations, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Ford Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation. These are just money laundering outfits. The oil companies, the banks put their money into these foundations, and then it gets laundered and sent out to different subversive groups. Anyway, this investigator went to see the head of the Ford Foundation, H. Rowan Gaither, and Gaither said, "Now, why is Congressman Reese interested in our foundations?" The investigator said, "Well, Congressman is concerned over the contributions you make to, obviously, subversive groups. Well, would you like to know why we do what we do?" The investigator said, "Yes, I would." He said, "We are operating under directives issued from the White House," and this is in 1953, Eisenhower White House, "substance of which make every effort so to alter the United States as to allow a comfortable merger with the Soviet Union." So the investigator said, "Well, would you mind repeating that to the full House committee?" "Oh, no," he said, "I wouldn't dream of doing that. I just thought you should know that we are operating on directives from the White House." Because all these tax-exempt foundations, and many more, are all headed by members of the CFR. The head of the Federal Reserve is a member of the CFR. Now, which is more important, Federal Reserve? I don't know. But if the chairman is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, it seems to me that the CFR is the key thing. Now, Coleman had his reasons for thinking that there was a more centralized, smaller group, and I'm sure he was right. It's like the Freemasons. You get to the 32nd degree, you have to be invited into the 33rd degree. You can't work your way into it the way you worked your way up from the 1st to the 32nd. I just think that the whole CFR and the whole syndicate has to be wiped out. There's just no alternative. You can't arrest them. On what charge? Because the district attorney or attorney general would never cooperate. The police would never say, "Oh, yeah, okay, you guys go to jail because you're doing bad things." No, there's no legal procedural way to address this problem we have, created essentially by Colonel House. That's why I led in with this guy. They created a monster with no legal recourse. So that's why I say we must have revolution. I mean, there's got to be constant revolution. We just can't be going on with this federal system anymore. It's broken down. It's totally corrupt. John Birch was over in China before the war started, and when Jimmy Doolittle did that 30 seconds over Tokyo raid with the B-25s taken off from the O.S.S. Hornet and doing this suicide attack on Tokyo, some of the planes did manage to get China and crash land, Doolittle's being among them. This kid from Macon, Georgia was sitting in a restaurant. This Chinese guy came up to him and said, if you're an American, come with me. So Birch went out and met Jimmy Doolittle and his crew. And they said, can you get us back to Kunming or Chongqing or wherever the Nationalist Chinese headquarters was at that point? John Birch was a missionary, but he led Doolittle and these other guys to safety. And then he was kind of recruited into the 14th Chenal Group Air Force. He became an intelligence officer. He was commissioned as a lieutenant, finally made captain. By the end of the war, the O.S.S. took over. He was working for the O.S.S. in China. He said, I'd rather be a private under Chenal than a colonel in O.S.S. The O.S.S. sent Birch on this mission after the war ended to go up and meet with the Japanese who had surrendered and then go on and meet with the communists who had been our allies during the war. Didn't do any fighting against Japanese, really, just fighting against Chiang Kai-shek. So Birch spent the night with the Japanese after they surrendered, and he and his party of 8 or 10 guys carried on up farther north and eventually encountered the communist Chinese. And he said he wanted to speak with their leader. They wouldn't tell him who their leader was, and they finally disarmed him and his Chinese interpreter and bayoneted John Birch to death and bayoneted his interpreter, but he didn't die, and he told the story. So it's obvious to me that the O.S.S. arranged for the murder of John Birch because he knew they were a bunch of communist traitors and that they wanted to bring Mao Zedong to power. That was really obvious to him, and of course that's exactly what happened. The O.S.S. not only brought Ho Chi Minh to power in Indochina, it put Kim Il-sung to power in North Korea. So that's the nature of the O.S.S. It's the communist guys. The O.S.S. was a bunch of bankers and lawyers. MacArthur wouldn't allow them to operate in his theater. I met a guy named Calvin Lee. He was with the Defense Intelligence Agency. He asked me, do you know why the O.S.S. was changed into the CIA? Well, I guess there were communists in the O.S.S., so I guess they wanted to start over again. Wrong. He says, first of all, the O.S.S. was formed by Roosevelt, Donovan, and William Stevenson of the British intelligence. What they wanted to do was operate in France, and they wanted to have the immediate cooperation of the French communists. Calvin Lee told me that the plan was to have 50% of the members of this new organization, the Office of Strategic Services, O.S.S., be made up of American Communist Party members, so that the French underground, which was largely communist, would immediately cooperate. Otherwise, if they tried to start a new organization with no communist membership, then the communists in France that were fighting the Germans would not cooperate. So the O.S.S. was ordered to be 50% members of the CPUSA. But it communized so much of the world, all of Southeast Asia and China. George Marshall, we know now, was essentially an agent of Stalin, working under his boss, Harry Hopkins, who was, we now learn, Stalin's #1 agent in America. Harry Hopkins was Franklin Roosevelt's Colonel House. He was his closest alter ego advisor, lived in the White House. Marshall, when he was Secretary of State under Truman, the U.S. Congress was uneasy with the way America suddenly turned on Chiang Kai-shek and was saying, hey, we want the communists in charge in China. We don't want Chiang Kai-shek in charge. Yeah, but he was our ally during the... Doesn't matter. We want the communists to take over China. So the U.S. Congress said, well, that's not so good. And they voted to send a whole shipload of arms to Chiang Kai-shek because George Marshall had given all the captured Japanese weapons to Mao Zedong, the communist, and was disarming Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist Chinese, the anti-communists. Before it could get there, Marshall had the ship sunk in the Bay of Bengal. That's how diabolical these guys were, and pro-communist. When MacArthur on the Philippines was surrounded by the Japanese, they didn't get any weapons at all. They didn't get any resupply. MacArthur kept being promised by Eisenhower, who was now his boss, that ships are coming with stuff, and MacArthur would tell his men, well, they tell me reinforcements to ships are coming with equipment and ammunition. Not a ship was sent. Where was all the stuff going? Harry Hopkins was sending it to Russia, to Stalin, and to England. Not a single thing got to the Philippines, and that's why the surrender happened and the Bataan Death March and all the atrocities, because Eisenhower and George Marshall refused to reinforce the guys in the Philippines. Treason. Sending all that stuff to Stalin instead. That's the reality. That's the O.S.S. mentality. Now it's just degenerated into total catastrophe, and the only possible solution is to fight, just like the rebels did in the 18th century. They fought against central government, total corruption. Theirs was a monarchy. Ours is dictatorship. Pure and simple. And if we don't fight, we're screwed. We got no choice. We've got to fight. Whether it's wiping out the Council on Foreign Relations just for openers, the Federal Reserve has to be destroyed and never be allowed again. You never have a private central bank issuing private currency. The only possible way out of this is to issue debt-free currency the way the Hungarians are doing. We've got to follow everything the Hungarians did, including what they did in October 1956. People just want to study that. It's just exactly what we need. And now they've issued debt-free currency. It's being hushed up. That's the only way we can save this country. The Federal Reserve has to be exterminated. We've been led down the path of the slaughterhouse by the Federal Reserve. Well, our neighbor, a sweet gal at the time, but she thought we were crazy. She just didn't take us seriously. She was very friendly. But one morning she was talking to my wife on the phone, and we just lived next door to each other in Idaho, and the phones got cut off, and we tried to reestablish contact on their cell phones, and she finally called back and said, my God, they're trying to burn the house down. We rushed down there. It was kind of a cold weather, and she had felt a draft coming up from downstairs. The door was always locked, but no, the door's wide open. She just got her 3-year-old child with her. The husband wasn't home. Goes down, looks outside, and they've hit the outside wooden wall with a firebomb. It's blazing away, so she kind of grabs the thing with her fingers and burns herself and gets it away from the wall. Goes over and gets a water hose. It's connected. She finally called the sheriff and reported this arson. It turned out to be attempted murder. But she'd noticed in the days leading up to this that she'd been followed around the area by this white SUV with blacked out windows. And later in the day, after the sheriff came and did this phony investigation, he drove down again into town, in the town of Driggs, Idaho. And again, there was this white SUV behind her with the blacked out windows. So this time she hit the brakes fast, but the thing had to go past her, and she made the license plate. Amazingly, her father works for the FBI. So she called him and said, "Hey, can you run a plate for me?" 2 hours later, he calls back and says, "Well, it's the FBI out of Jackson, Wyoming." So the FBI was trying to intimidate her and isolate us because we've been up against it now for a long time and don't have many friends. But this gal, she said, "I believe you now. I believe everything you're saying."
I was born in Chicago back in 46, moved out to California 1960, high school there, Carmel, and then went to college in Reno. Kind of got involved in discovering politics. I'd studied communism quite a bit over in England, trying to figure out what that was all about. And I noticed there was quite a bit of it on the campus there at University of Nevada. So I became quite active. I had a thing called Freedom Corps on campus and raised a lot of hell with the professors. But somebody in Carson City, a fellow named Mike Oliver, sent me to British Honduras, which today is called Belize, and he sent me to South Africa and to Rhodesia. And I was just a kid. I was like 24 years old, and he had me negotiating with these governments for the purchase of 100 square miles minimum of land for a tax haven. And unfortunately, all 3 attempts were unsuccessful, but I joined up with them, and I fought in their anti-terrorist war for a couple of years. That kind of shaped my life. That really kind of made me who I became. And I started drilling oil wells with ARCO in 1975 as a drilling foreman. By 1983, I wrote a manuscript of this book called The New American Man, A Call to Arms. And I started the militia movement because I decided I was going to bring down the invisible government. My particular interest is the Council on Foreign Relations. I knew that a lot of guys didn't want to seem like outlaws, so I gave them this name, the militia, which nobody knew in those days. I didn't really understand it that well myself, but I started researching it and found the Second Amendment, because of the wording of it, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Well, doing more research, I found there's nobody that's authorized to regulate the militia. For the past 150 years, since 1847, the judges have always said, well, this pistol, this blackjack, this sawed-off shotgun, this submachine gun, it's got nothing to do with a well-regulated militia, and you should go to prison. So I didn't like the idea of the militia until I discovered the Militia Act of 1792. One of the reasons for the militia, it said, was to suppress combinations too powerful for the ordinary course of judicial proceedings. That's what I'm trying to do, is suppress this combination called the Council on Foreign Relations. A combination is like a gang. It's an old word for organized crime. So that's why I started pushing this militia idea for guys who needed kind of a legalistic excuse to get involved. And it really took off like wildfire. To me, Patrick Henry was the greatest of the founders. He actually led the militia to recover the stolen powder that Governor Dunmore swiped from the colonists. He started out with a few guys marching towards Dunmore's headquarters. By the time he got there, he had 5,000 guys with him. He was a great enemy of the Constitution when they were trying to give it to us in secret. They were supposed to modify the Articles of Confederation because they wanted to raise revenues, and the Articles didn't really provide for that. Instead, they came up with this 7-part program for a government, which turns out was given to them by the local Masonic lodges. That's where they got the framework for the Constitution, and it was done in secret, and nobody really knew what had happened for quite a long time afterward. Then we got this central government. Well, then we find out Alexander Hamilton, who always wanted to give us this privately owned central bank, it needed a central government to enforce it. And that's how we got stuck with this thing. And what isn't constitutional? What has the Supreme Court ever found to be unconstitutional, except for a couple of things that Franklin Roosevelt tried to pull? Since 1937, the Supreme Court hasn't found one single thing to be unconstitutional. I'll give you an example. In 1918, the Supreme Court said it was okay to draft militiamen for foreign service. Because somebody said, well, wait a minute, you can't take the militia over to Europe. What are you doing? Oh, no, the Supreme Court said that's fully constitutional. So you get the idea. There's no check and balance on the Supreme Court. We got this great system of checks and balances. There's no check and balance on the Supreme Court. I agree. We have to follow the Constitution. And if we did, probably 90% of our problems would disappear. But the Constitution has never protected us. There is a basic conflict between the Constitution's first 7 articles and the next 10 articles of amendment, which are the Bill of Rights. Really, the Bill of Rights was put there by Patrick Henry, George Mason, and some others as a protection against this Constitution. So they're basically in conflict. The next 17 really represent our downfall. The Declaration of Independence is the greatest document ever written, but it's not reflected in the Constitution, which is just a 7-part program for running a government. We got billions of dollars being funneled into 435 congressmen and 100 senators, the president, and so forth. It's too much money for such a tiny bunch of guys. They can't withstand this type of financial pressure and bribery, which is all it is. Our government is run by bribery, vote fraud, and murder when necessary. When bribery and vote fraud don't work, then they just kill you. So it's a dangerous place. How do these 435 congressmen withstand this type of lobbying pressure? It's shown to be impossible, because if they don't go along, they'll be beaten in the next election. There's just too much money available. That's why I would propose this overthrow. I'm trying to emulate the founders of this country. Those guys weren't Americans fighting a foreign government. They were British subjects fighting the British government. That was a very dangerous thing they did. They could have all been hanged. Dunmore said he would hang Patrick Henry if he could have caught him. And the same with a lot of the other guys, too. The Military Commissions Act, Patriot Act, and all these John Warner things. That's just an act of war against the American people. Just beyond description as far as treason. It's treachery against America. And there's no peaceful way, as far as I can tell, to deal with this. That's why I started the militia movement, because I'm not going to try to overthrow the Congress or the presidency. The policy is made by the Council on Foreign Relations. They wanted to pick all the State Department employees, everything to do with foreign relations, and try to merge us into a foreign government. But they run domestic policy, too. This outfit on Park Avenue and 68th Street in New York is the seat of all evil. It has killed millions since its founding in 1921. And the guys who founded it were actually in charge of the Woodrow Wilson administration since 1912. These are the guys that put the communists in power in Russia. Leon Trotsky was living with 350 of his guys on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. They put him on a boat, sent him to St. Petersburg to meet up with Vladimir Lenin. Mao Zedong killed 64 million of his own people, but he was put in power by the Council on Foreign Relations. This is the invisible government, and it has to be overthrown. It has to be destroyed because it's killing the world, not only us, but millions of people around the world. Back in 1953, when Congressman Carroll Reese attempted to investigate the tax-exempt foundations, I've interviewed his chief investigator, Norman Dodd, before he died. He said, "Listen, Campbell, we've overdiagnosed the problem." Dodd got a letter from Rowan Gaither with the Ford Foundation. That's how I got into this thing. Gaither said, "Would you mind coming over here and chatting with us?" So he went over to the Ford Foundation and said, "Now, Mr. Dodd, why is Congressman Reese so curious about the foundations?" "Well, you have been involved in some rather subversive activities. You've funded a lot of very unpleasant groups." Gaither said, "Would you like to know why we do this?" And Dodd said, "Yes." Well, he said, "We here in the foundation come from the O.S.S. and we are operating under directives issued by the White House. Would you like to know the substance of these directives?" "Yes." "We should make every effort so to alter the United States that we could be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union." He said, "Would you mind repeating that to the full House committee?" "Oh, no," he said, "I wouldn't, but I'm just telling you for your own benefit so you understand what you're up against here." So the investigation was stymied. Wayne Hayes from Ohio killed that investigation. That's how they launder money, through the tax-exempt foundations. But it's all done by the Council on Foreign Relations. So, people say to me, "Well, what about the Federal Reserve?" I said, "Yeah, the Federal Reserve is the engine of our destruction. But the chairman and the directors are all members of the Council on Foreign Relations. You take out the CFR, a lot of our problems are going to disappear." The CIA, which is like the secret police for the CFR, they were unable to keep the Soviet Union afloat so that we could be merged. But an important aspect of World War II was to communize China. The Council on Foreign Relations was supporting Chiang Kai-shek, the anti-communist, for the war years, but they kept insisting that Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists cooperate with the communists of Mao Zedong. But of course, those guys had been fighting for 20 years before that, so they weren't going to cooperate. After the war, our Secretary of State, George Marshall, who had been the Army Chief of Staff under Roosevelt during the war, he disarmed Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists and armed the communists with the captured Japanese weapons, and the anti-communist nationalists had to leave. They had to go to the little island of Formosa, which they called Taiwan, and it was American policy that communized China. The O.S.S. actually brought Mao Zedong to power, and they brought Ho Chi Minh to power in North Vietnam. The U.S. Congress in 1964 estimated that since 1949, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai had slaughtered 64 million Chinese people. Now, this was like the emerging middle class or anybody with a second-grade education. They were all wiped out. And then a few years later, Richard Nixon went to Beijing, toasted Mao Zedong, and it signaled the United States corporations that it was now time to shut down American industry and transfer it to China so that we could exploit these communist slaves that the Council on Foreign Relations had created by putting their puppet Mao Zedong into power. So when we see Walmart now flooding our country with Chinese crap and paying these low wages, this is the Council on Foreign Relations policy for America based on Chinese slave wages and deindustrialization. I remember Bill Clinton and Rush Limbaugh jamming NAFTA down our throats and making fun of Ross Perot when he said, well, if you pass this NAFTA thing, the next thing you're going to hear is this giant sucking sound of American jobs leaving the country. Well, boy, was that correct. But that was Republicans and Democrats. They tag teamed us. Domestically now, the CFR is pushing two things, foreign trade zones, 257 of these sovereign territories on American soil. That's one thing. And then the other thing is this North American Union, which merges the Mexican and the Canadian governments with the American government. There's one foreign trade zone where I live in Idaho. So I called the county commissioner up in Boundary County that's in charge of this foreign trade zone, number 242. It's out of 257. They confirmed it. And I did a little research and found out down here near where I live in Pocatello, the Chinese-owned polysilicon factory, part of foreign trade zone 242, way up on the Canadian border, hundreds of miles away. So I asked them in Boundary County, Idaho, you've got the foreign trade zone up there right on the border, but you've got this factory down here. It's also a foreign trade zone. He said, that's right. So this polysilicon, it's just sand. They manufacture it into polysilicon. They send this stuff in raw chunk form to China, tax-free and no inspections, no nothing. And it comes back to Hawaii, foreign trade zone number 9 or something like that. And it's distributed to the United States as solar panels. There's no inspections, customs, border patrol, nothing. It's a sovereign territory like an embassy. I don't know that all 257 of these foreign trade zones are Chinese. I'm not saying that because you look at them, all the Fortune 100 companies are operating in these foreign trade zones in our country. And they get to send stuff out with no inspections, taxes, nothing. They sell it to Americans and the Americans have to pay the taxes. But the foreigners and the corporations doing business in these foreign trade zones don't. America is supposed to be run by excise taxes on foreign goods. When you do away with the legitimate way to raise revenue, which is by taxes on foreign goods, well, that's gone now. These guys don't have to do that. So it's just a massive fraud. And I would urge everybody to investigate his or her own foreign trade zone in whatever state he or she's in. I asked the commissioner up in Foreign Trade Zone 242, what about the one in Boise? I don't know about that. Well, the fellow in Boise, Terry Shepard, investigated and got an admission from the governor of Idaho that, in fact, that's true. 30,000 acres. This took me totally by surprise when I researched that 30,000 acre deal. There is a foreign trade zone at Boise of 255 acres granted by the Department of Commerce in 1992. Nobody had a clue that this was going on in this country. I mean, I didn't. I can only say that in my state, it's true. It's Chinese. I don't know about the other ones, but this one is true. I'm not saying that Chinese are being smuggled in. I'm just saying there is no protection. There's no inspection. They can be bringing in drugs, nuclear devices in containers because there's no inspection allowed, either in or out. So how does that work? I mean, how can a government call itself a government and not protect us from this sort of subversion? Well, obviously they're not going to protect us because they're in on this scheme to merge us with at least Mexico and Canada. Now, in Mexico, we got already this foreign trade zones called maquiladoras. That's what that is. Along the Mexican border, you got 1.3 million Mexicans working for American companies like Ford Motor Company and Ray-Ban and whoever the hell else is down there. That doesn't include the subzones. Who would have known that foreign trade zone 242 in Idaho would have a subzone 242A? Nobody knows that. You got to dig to find out this stuff. I think the struggle between good and evil, as far as we're concerned, is a struggle between nationalism and internationalism. And the Council on Foreign Relations represents internationalism. It's like another word for communism is international socialism. We just have to come to terms with bringing down this private group that has been making American foreign policy since 1921 and even before they became formally organized as the Council on Foreign Relations. George Bush refused to enforce our border with Mexico. He even tipped off the Mexicans where these Minutemen were located so that the invaders could go around them. That's how bad our situation is. I don't know if Obama's any better. There's no federal enforcement of these foreign trade zones, no matter where they are, inside the country or on the ports. I'll never forget that 60 Minutes years ago that showed the woman and her husband in China. They already had one child, and the block commissar, this old grandma, she was watching all the women to make sure they weren't getting pregnant. And this one gal just kept getting more and more expectant. So the old gal said, when are you going to take care of that? Oh, anytime now. But they tried to keep the second child. So eventually the block commissar had her arrested. The cops dragged her up to a room, threw her on a table, and injected her stomach with this vile substance that killed the baby. I mean, they just showed it right on 60 Minutes. That's the Chinese way. Harvesting organs from political prisoners. These people are pretty hardcore, and we do not want to be in business with them. I know Walmart depends on it, but it's not American. The American way is keep it simple, stupid. And the simplest solution is to get rid of this organization. It has no right to exist. It has no right to be making foreign policy or domestic policy. It's a private group. They masquerade as a think tank, a watering hole for vacationing drunks, or whatever they tell us from decade to decade, but they make the most homicidal policies for foreigners and for us. So it has to be taken on by Americans and destroyed.